So, good evening. I'm Jaroslav Dumanowski, food historian from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Poland. I work on the old cookbooks, and I'm very happy to be chair of this section of Orrin Museum Conference, section devoted to the lecture discovering, analyzing of Jewish cookbooks. We have 3 papers, 3 eminent specialists who will present us different ways of learning, of reading, discussing, discovering old Jewish culinary texts. Our section is devoted to corporal turn and cookbooks as a way of showing how this lecture, how this kind of primary sources may contribute to enrich what exactly? Social history, cultural history. What can we really discover reading culinary text, accepting, of course, the way of cooking different dishes? So we got 3 participants, 3 or 4 of papers. And we start with Susan Belovary, with her paper, The Unknown Ingredient, Viennese Cuisine Before Hitler. Susan Belovary is archivist for faculty papers, working at University Library of Illinois University. And she worked from very long time on the topic how Jewish cuisine contributed to enriching the Viennese cuisine. She concentrates on mutual influences on a very interesting way, how Jewish cuisine shaped Viennese cuisine, or how Jewish cuisine became Viennese cuisine. So I think that we may start with paper of Susan Belovary. It should take 20 minutes time. So Susan, you are asked to start.
Okay, so what I will do is I'm going to share the screen, and then I don't see you. You let me know if you can hear me. Yeah? So can you hear me?
Yeah.
And you see it?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good.
Perfect.
Then I can start. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present my research. Ever since the 1880s, the Viennese proudly identified with their cuisine. For them, it was a form of art and a mixture of traditions from across the empire, particularly from Bohemia and Hungary. As the only city-based cuisine known internationally, it left lasting traces in the arts, publications, and even legal and family disputes. Unknown today, however, is the fact that this famous Viennese cuisine was a shared cuisine, an outgrowth of collective and collaborative efforts of Jews and non-Jews alike. Today, I won't talk about how this developed over 150 years. You can read about this online. I'll talk about how I started my research, introduce some unusual sources, some of which I contextualize and read against the grain. It all started in Illinois in 1997. My job was to clean the house of Orthodox Jews of Austro-Hungarian and Eastern European background. We became friends, and because I quickly learned kosher rules, they also had me clean and cook for Orthodox Passover, and I did so for 10 years. When they asked me, however, to bake the typical Pesach desserts, I balked. I had grown up in Vienna eating classical Viennese cuisine and desserts of my mother. My maternal grandmother had run a small Viennese coffee house, and her desserts were so renowned that my older cousins would bike 120 miles across the Alps to get a slice. My paternal grandmother had been an aristocratic pastry chef in Styria. In this family, the recipes handed to me for Orthodox Pesach desserts were not palatable. Instead, I leafed through my grandmother and mother's handwritten cookbook, as well as my copy of the authoritative Viennese cookbook from the interwar period by Olga and Adolf Hess. And I baked our typical Christmas cookies and a Viennese almond cake, for instance, and used some of the techniques I'd learned at home. None of these dishes used leavening, flour, or fermentable ingredients, which are prohibited during Pesach. And while Pesach guests were delighted and wanted the recipes, I was puzzled. How was it possible that many of my grandmother's recipes, menu plans, and those of the Hess cookbook were applicable to even the strictest Jewish culinary rules without needing to be adjusted? Was our classical Viennese cuisine perhaps a shared collective product, practice, and legacy of Viennese Jews and non-Jews alike? Over the next 20 years, I was able to show this shared cuisine in which both had long met through food and foodways, producing, selling, eating, teaching, writing about, and representing food culturally, with each making their contributions. It was reflected in restaurants and cookbooks, terms used and dishes, food institutions and cultural representations, and in the many culinary biographies crossing religion and class. The Aryanization of food businesses and a cookbook was the dark side of the coin. Enduring evidence is found in the practices of Jews who identified with the Viennese cuisine and in how Holocaust survivors and refugees, although they were allowed to bring very little, brought along their Viennese cookbooks and recipes. Cooking Viennese dishes provided sustenance as food, memories, cultural practice, but also as income when many women made a living working as Viennese cooks and pastry chefs when first abroad. Refugees cooked and enjoyed dishes closely identified with a city whose residents had expelled or tried to kill them. They didn't consider it as other or tainted. It was theirs. This is quite remarkable. The same survivors rejected cultural products, such as the music of Richard Wagner and Strauss, as National Socialist, and spurned writing the cursive T with a horizontal slash because it resembled the Christian cross. Finding relevant records has been quite difficult, though. Food historical, popular cultural, and women's records have long been ignored by archives, research, and newspapers, and still are to some degree. Traditional culinary records are rare, except for cookbooks that became more widespread by the 1850s. Recipes are typically not authored. Lists of ingredients are not intellectual property, are usually appropriated without references to creators, and rarely indicate religious proclivities, nor should they. Cooks and authors, increasingly lower middle-class women, normally hadn't published anything else to help trace them. Women changed surnames upon marriage and were usually forbidden to work outside the anonymity of home. I was hampered by stringent privacy laws, cemetery policies, anti-Semitism prompting conversions, pseudonyms, and name changes, 2 world wars, the Holocaust, related destruction of records, and the dispersal of Viennese Jews. I struggled with how to define a shared cuisine and how to prove it, constantly reanalyzing what it was or meant to people and how to document it pushed me beyond simply considering cookbooks and recipes. I realized it's cooks, scientists, housewives, servants, and those who eat. It's available food items and processed ingredients. It's kitchen appliances and designs. It's food manufacturing and retail. It's the hospitality industry and charity institutions, such as coffee houses and soup kitchens. It's cooking schools and dietary advice. It's cultural representations in books, posters, poems, music, cartoons, memories, etc., and folklore practices seen in children rhymes and cooking traditions. As you have seen, I started my research through common and uncommon source materials, family culinary practices, recipes, and the act of cooking with Jewish friends. Let's look at a few others. If a shared cuisine indeed existed, my main focus would be on collaboration and contributions, and not as much on the so-called typical Jewish or Catholic cuisine and recipes. But I had to start there to understand changes over time, and today's examples will reflect this. Moritz Safir, a converted journalist and author, already recognized the interwoven nature of Viennese cookery by 1850. His are the only thorough descriptions I found about traditional Viennese Jewish dishes. By 1847, he lamented how observant Jews and their religious and ethnically based cuisine had disappeared. While still missing the old cuisine 4 years later, Safir's article then praised the emancipation restaurants that offer one cuisine in the use of two nations and include everything for everyone and in a superb fashion. Not only Jews had emancipated, having gained most rights after the Revolution 1848, but so had their cuisine. Perhaps then, a shared Viennese cuisine began early. How do I prove this, though, when it became so matter-of-fact that neither Jews nor non-Jews saw a need to comment on it? Safir gave a cue. In 1840, he wrote a book review about a Jewish cookbook from Pressburg, and so I began to look for Viennese Jewish cookbooks. Elsewhere in the Habsburg Empire, Budapest, Prague, Pressburg, such Jewish cookbooks catered to observant Jews and won awards even at international fairs in Vienna. The German Empire saw a similar proliferation of Jewish cookbooks. I didn't find a single Jewish Viennese cookbook before 1938, however. This left me confused and unsure about my research. But what if I read this differently? Think of The Hound of the Baskervilles, the famous Sherlock Holmes story from 1902 with the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The dog did not bark, which Holmes eventually realized was significant and led him to solve the case. Perhaps me not finding any Jewish Viennese cookbooks was significant in itself and indicated what I was looking for, a shared and emancipated cuisine. In Vienna, the imperial capital, authors apparently saw no need or market for Viennese Jewish cookbooks. Instead, Jews published many general Viennese cookbooks, and explicitly Jewish cookbooks from abroad had to be ordered by mail. Records of failed attempts may support such a conclusion. In spring 1901, someone wanted to publish what she called the first ever Viennese Jewish cookbook under strict observance of the ritual kitchen. She was self-publishing because she clearly hadn't found a publisher among the many also Jewish publishing houses selling cookbooks. To ascertain potential sales, she asked readers of a Jewish newspaper to send her expressions of interest and deposits. Very few Jews and Orthodox Jews must have done so because she never published the cookbook. A son dying that year may have stopped her from doing so, yet she never again picked up the project. Instead, joining the many Jewish cookbook authors, she self-published a general Viennese cookbook in 1912. Poetry and other cultural artifacts may also be good records telling us what people ate, considered important and shared. From the 1850s on, Jewish, non-Jewish, official Catholic, and anti-Semitic newspapers, the other widespread reports we have on culinary developments besides cookbooks, mention fewer and fewer typical Jewish dishes, or what they considered as such. In a rare example, readers in 1893 encountered an anonymous poem about a dream. Here, the author praised iconic Jewish dishes which a Catholic dignitary had refused to eat when visiting a Jewish millionaire. Dishes included the carp, the kugel, the goose, the shallot, the baches, and the layered cake known as fladen, which the author wrote could bridge the chasm between Christendom and Jews. 30 years later, most of these were no longer regarded as Jewish. They had become Viennese and were routinely included in cookbooks, practices, and representations. Folklore may show how Jews incorporated typical Christian dishes into their holidays. For example, in a children's rhyme and culinary practices told to me by survivors. Think about what it takes for a rhyme to become part of widespread popular culture. And then what it takes for a Jewish rhyme, children's rhyme about Purim, to include both prototypical Catholic and Jewish pastries. How far did a shared cuisine have to come? How firmly did it have to be established to be reflected in a popular Jewish rhyme used from at least the 1880s to 1938? This was not a one-way street. The fladen, the once prototypical Jewish tort, actually did bridge the chasm between Christendom and Jews. It shows up in a poem for little girls, published in a women's newspaper during World War I. In it, a little girl addresses war shortages in employment, kitchen utensils, ingredients, dishes, and fuel. Juxtaposing cheap and pricey food and dishes, that had become too expensive, she rhymes bread with fladen, bacon, and roast, for example. Of course, for the poem to work and be published at the time, the fladen had to be as matter of fact as bread for all girls and mothers. This segs nicely into discussing anti-Semitic culinary depictions in cartoons, poems, and writings. Wanting to make stereotypical arguments, they exaggerated and clearly drew the other, the Jew, whom like-minded people could recognize. And they used dishes and eating habits to distinguish Jews from non-Jews, or more precisely, they used what they presumed to be culinary distinctions. Alas, they had almost no culinary stereotypes left in their bags of tricks by 1900, and the ones they used were obsolete. For instance, in the 1890s, an anti-Semitic agitator spoke against the Social Democratic press, which he considered to be Jewish. His diatribe was couched in culinary terms, namely blood sausage eating workers. Note, it was a Viennese Jew who invented a blood flour a few years later, and garlic eating social democrats. Note, Safar bemoaned the disappearance of garlic in Jewish cuisine in 1850. In the 1890s, an anti-Semitic menu only mentioned cliché Jewish names, features, and politics in its Jewish dishes, apologetically nodding to garlic, pork, and fish, when carp was already a classic Christmas dish. Even the ever-present anti-Semitic topic of pork, for example, during the 1848 revolution, turned into a non-issue. Many Viennese Jews routinely ate pork, which even the leading anti-Semitic journal acknowledged in the above menu. During World War I inflation, its anti-Semitic spoof about artists' salaries listed a Jewish composer demanding a hog for his opus. Other sources bear this out. The City Without Jews, the novel by the converted Hugo Bettauer from 1922, notes that pork lard was much cheaper after Jews had been expelled. And market statistics until 1938 show that the Viennese consumed more pork than beef since early 1900. Its consumption had doubled by 1936, and it was almost as cheap, which, by the way, contradicts Viennese culinary history writing about pork. And cookbooks by Viennese Jews routinely included pork recipes and pork lard. Here it's interesting that matzahs, the distinct Jewish food, rarely showed up in anti-Semitic texts, namely in 1869 and 1895. With shared restaurants, cookbooks, and dishes, linguistic differentiations also began to disappear. Terms for religious holidays, dishes, and ingredients became increasingly interchangeable in Jewish, non-Jewish, and anti-Semitic newspapers, ads, cookbooks, and fairs. Baches, the Shabbat bread, was also known as braided bread. Made with or without milk, it fit with kosher meals. Non-Jews ate it as dessert. Even recipes containing lard could be kosher. Cookbooks by Jews, non-Jews, and Jewish cookbooks from abroad used the term lard and rarely specified if it was pork, beef, goose, or vegetable lard. Easter referred to Jewish Pesach and Christian Easter. Matzah and matzo meal were also called Easter bread, breadcrumbs, or semolina. Shavuot, sholet, was now called richer. Keep in mind, when Jews and non-Jews collectively invent, produce, name, sell, and consume food items, eaten sometimes for different reasons though, historical records become hard to decipher, and one has to pay attention to context and contemporary connotations. Even the manner of indexing and listing recipes may reflect a shared cuisine. Let's look at the Hess cookbook here. A shared cuisine can also be seen in recipes one could use in kosher and Pesach cooking, as I did in Urbana, but which for others were simply dishes with or without certain ingredients. But how does one find these recipes in the Hess? Knowing the names of dishes, cooks usually use an alphabetical index to locate a recipe. The Hess, however, also included a systematic index, listing recipes by types of dishes and ingredients. Looking for dishes by ingredients, you can also locate the many recipes for kosher dishes. Keywords helped find recipes without dairy, flour, animal fats, various types of meat, leavening, or recipes substituting for meat and dairy. Almost every section included at least one recipe suitable for strict Pesach cooking, including boiled elderberries made with and without flour and milk. The systematic index may appear unremarkable, but its granular classification system is fundamentally only of use for kosher cuisine. Not even the strictest diet for the sick needs this detailed. Cookbooks don't exist in a vacuum. They mirror a city in which Jews and non-Jews interacted daily through foodstuff. We no longer have reliable statistics on the Jewish participation in food businesses before March 38. The census stopped cross-referencing religion with professions after 1910. Statistics by contemporary anti-Semitic authors are largely unverifiable. And unorganized Aryanization of Jewish properties, as well as undocumented flight by Jews, frustrated even National Socialist record-keeping. Jewish participation in the food industry was extensive, though, based on Jewish community reports, anecdotal data, recent research, restitution cases, biographies, and the arts. Jews owned and managed food-related businesses and shops, hospitality industry or soup kitchens. Both groups interacted through servants, waiters, cooks, cookbooks, and cooking schools run by Jews and non-Jews. They shopped in non-kosher and kosher stores, purchased Viennese cookbooks published by Jewish authors, and were guests at each other's homes or worked there as staff, who might attend servant and cooking courses run by Jewish philanthropists. Suitable Viennese cuisine or food preparation wasn't only disseminated through cookbooks, radio, newspaper seminars, and cooking schools. Year-long food courses were offered for the less wealthy and less educated. Here, leading Viennese Jewish scientists, physicians, home economics teachers, cookbook authors, cooks, activists, interior architects, and philanthropists taught shopping, finances, markets, ingredients, surrogates, storage and hygiene, kitchen equipment and design, menus, and cooking certain foods and diets. The multi-layered lives of people contextualize books and cuisine in the public and private sphere. The Catholic Theresia Ballauf was a cook for the Jewish aristocrat Arnstein before she ran a cooking school and published one of the early Viennese cookbooks and cookbooks for women, which revealed some influence of Jewish cookery. The Jewish pastry chef Jacob Epstein invented, manufactured, and sold foodstuff that reflected revolutionary changes in preservation and processing, for which he received a medal at the 1873 World Exposition. And his was perhaps the first modern food processor. He wrote two of the earliest and rare Viennese pastry cookbooks, whose hundreds of recipes, including the Fladen, shaped patisserie in trade schools, pastry shops, gastronomical circles, and households. My Protestant grandmother lived and worked for a Budapest Jewish family as a teenager, and then settled next to Jewish neighbors and friends, stores and restaurants on Matzes Island. She learned firsthand what was widely known in Vienna, kosher rules and a shared cuisine. What she knew and liked about such dishes, menus, and ingredients, she adopted and adapted. And she bequeathed all this and copies of the Hess cookbook to her 3 daughters and her grandchildren, myself included, which later triggered my research. Or look at the contributors to the Hess cookbook. The Jewish engineer Friedrich Skalitzer invented and manufactured a more nutritious flour to feed the poor and was shot in Theresienstadt in 1944. The converted physician William Schlesinger pioneered the study of metabolism, nutrition, and diabetes, lectured about diets to university students, war doctors, butchers, housewives, and brides, and published popular dietary books with Vienna's health department. He managed to flee in 1939. And the chemist and professor of hygiene, Heinrich Reichel, taught food hygiene at trade cooking schools and in public courses. But he also popularized race, eugenics, and biology in schools, the sciences, and the public, and trained a cohort of eugenicists who later implemented the genocide against Jews and others. Now, any one piece of evidence be less than persuasive, or perhaps slightly off, but put together like pieces of a puzzle, of which you saw a few today, they recreate what was once a vibrant, collective culinary culture of Jews and non-Jews. It was perhaps the perfect example in an imperfect and anti-Semitic city of 2 formally distinct groups moving towards each other and integrating while daily creating, cooking, and eating one cuisine. This was to be expected of people who have lived so long and close to each other, and when there was still an us in Vienna before 1938, as fragile as it may have been. Thank you.
Yeah, it's time. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Perfect. Perfect. We fit perfectly in the time. So many thanks for this passionate paper. You already showed the sense of our meeting because talking on the food, culinary recipes, cookbooks, and cooks, you really referred to very important topics and notions like emancipation, assimilation, anti-Semitism. And you used a lot of very different sources. It was really impressive. I think that we will discuss it a bit later after all three papers. Some questions already appeared. Professor Kirschenblatt-Gimblet was, for example, really fascinated, as myself, by the personal story of this interest for Jewish cookery. I was also impressed by the fact that cooking together with Jewish friends may be conceived as a method. Actually, I do something a little similar with cooks who are interested in old historical cookery, but some researchers really are very prudent with this kind of discovering old food and food culture. It would be maybe something interesting to discuss. But we got the second paper, second author, and second subject. So next speaker is Kinga Julia Kirali, who is a writer, literary translator, dramaturg. She studied dramaturgy at the University of Drama in Târgu Mureș in Romania, then continued her studies in Budapest, in Hungary, and made a doctoral program in aesthetics. It's very interesting how the notion of aesthetics may be used in analysis of cookbooks, recipes, and all this culinary field. So this time we got, I think, a really different experience, a really different approach, what is very, very interesting for our meeting. Julia is the author of several plays and novels, translator, and she's currently conducting interviews for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Italy. And then she's an author of the book Recipes for a New Beginning, Transylvanian Jewish Stories of Life, Hunger, and Hope. So her contribution concerns recipes for a new beginning and this Transylvanian Jewish story of life, hunger, and hope. So, Julia, it's your turn. You're asked to start your presentation.
Well, thank you for introducing me and
20 minutes once again.
Good evening, or what time is it at your place? So we welcome. As Mr. Dumanovsky introduced me, I'm not a Holocaust researcher. I studied dramaturgy and literature, and I consider, first of all, myself a writer and literary translator. So when writing my book based on 10 in-depth interviews with Holocaust survivors in North Transylvania, my focus was on storytelling, the aspects of storytelling. Before starting the interviews, sorry, I'm just trying to move with my presentation. Here I am. It would be live. It's not working. Yeah, thank you. Before starting interviewing, since I was raised in Romania's communist regime, the so-called golden epoch, by that time, I had already known that I wouldn't have to stop at the dramatic turning point, the liberation. The subject I had on the brain was the question, what new beginning means. After a couple of encounters of my interviews, I realized new beginning is searching for normality, and normality consists of ephemeral things such as small states, familiar and cozy experiences. And while searching for the proper answer to my question, I had to deal, first of all, with the porosity of memory, the side effects of common and shared memories. Some interviews corrected themselves after the umpteen meeting, saying that they themselves did not know precisely, for instance, how many times they might have eaten on Liberation Day. After making more than 100 hours of interviews in different regions of Transylvania, new aspects of storytelling emerged, how to relate my interviews' testimonies so that they belong to present, that they not perish like many other stories of the past, since my targeted audience were not scholars, and as far as I could perceive among ordinary people, Holocaust fatigue was detectable. So I choose as dissemination, and I'm using this expression, the practice how I keep memory alive. I choose as dissemination cooking together with friends, cooking for a wider audience in order to imprint memories with tastes. Before getting into my methodology and conclusions, let me introduce in some historical background concerning the North Transylvanian Jewish identity. So mainly in Transylvania, it was characterized by the myth of religious tolerance, which was a fake myth, since the Studa Parliament in 1568, ages before, declared freedom and equality for 4 Christian religions. Obviously, this myth generated nostalgic dignity and arrogance, which led and leads the ongoing ethnic identity struggles that applies to Romanians, Hungarians, Jews, Saxons, Gypsies alike. In case of North Transylvanian Jewish community, there was a double twist regarding identity matters. The major part of Jewish community aspired to Hungarian cultural identity. They had assimilation desires. They were longing for urbanization and gentrification. Here, with this next upcoming 2 dias, I would like to have you a glimpse into the territory problem, which mark deeply the identity problems. On the right side, you can see the territory of Transylvania attached to Romania after the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. And once again, it's just not moving my dia. I hope. Yeah, once again on the right side, with marked with green, part of Transylvania reassigned after the Second Vienna War to Hungary. These are, as I've mentioned before, these territory problems mark deeply the identity matters of my testimonies. Here, I would like to highlight 2 of my cardinal testimonies. Lajos Erdélyi, a worldwide famous photographer who unfortunately we lost last year, and he was highlighting how aspiration to assimilation was a step forward in society, how it meant a social climbing. Another cardinal testimony, Julia Szilágyi, also an intellectual lecturer, professor, literary lecturer, professor, and at the university, mentioned me that how her father was delighted when he saw the entering Hungarian troops at Cluj. It was an early joy, and this upcoming dia is not it's not for shocking you. It is just the rabbi of Bystrica in North Transylvania giving a welcoming speech to arriving Hungarian troops who already brought with themselves the Nazi flag. So this early joy was rapidly turned into disappointment first, then desperation, and as all of you know, to the deportation of the Jewish community. From 4th of May 1944, 150,000 of Jews were deported from northern Transylvania, that is the entire community. 8 of 10 did not return. I think the foremost contradictory situation characterizes the community of Seeckler Sabbatarians, a small community in the heart of Transylvania whose ethnical identity, Seecklers, they were romanticized by power, and religious identity, Jewish, persecuted by power. To resolve this inconsistency, Hungarian government created a new position, a ministerial commissioner, to save the Seeckler Sabbatarian with forced baptism. Even if they were baptized, not all of them, I had to mention, they kept the kosher tradition. They ate in secret since the ban of Shekita prevailed, and during the night they took the geese in the box of Zinger sewing machine to kosher butcher into other towns. Finally, failed this institution of ministerial commissioner. They didn't want to save the Seeckler Sabbatarians, and the whole community was deported to Auschwitz as well. Unfortunately, there were no survivors or descendants in Transylvania anymore. Those few who survived the Holocaust made Aliyah, and their children refused to speak about their Seeckler Sabbatarian roots. They are denied absolutely their identity, Hungarian and Transylvanian identity. What about my approach and methodology? Initially, very naive, I wanted life stories, culinary life stories to get from my interviewees. I imagined that I will cook together with them while they are recalling culinary memories. I even made a promise that out of mercy, they were, and they still are above their 90s, we will not speak about the Holocaust. This early premise and promise failed very soon. The reason why? Because they have, although different attitudes, Holocaust could not be avoidable during culinary memories. Some of my interviews were already experienced in recalling and relating KZ memories, their former interview experiences and routine waved into their culinary memories. As it happened to Leopold Karpers, one of who born in Gyergyószentmiklós-Györgyen in 1924. No matter how conscious and experienced he was, he himself was shocked by the overwhelming food memories. When he started, for instance, to evoke a Sabbath dinner, he recalled the taste of the broth, the texture of the meat. He already recalled the memory of his little brother and his whole family exterminated in Auschwitz. Then later on, he consciously chose the latkes to prepare together, to cook together, because the potato, as he considered, was the leitmotif and the dominant dish of his life due to the pre-war poverty, then for stealing potato in the concentration camp. And it had also to do with liberation. I will present you, this was the latkes made together. I used this photo also in my book. And this is a photo made in Buchenwald on the Liberation Day, and those little boy highlighted is Leopold Karpers himself, who just grabbed a bucket full of potato right on the Liberation Day. Then there were those who made a vow not to speak at all during their lifetime about Holocaust. As it happened to Helena Kain, Auntie Helena, as I will refer to her further, while she was speaking of gastronomy, after all, they started, and she started to recall memories of persecution, deportation, starvation in concentration camp. Still waiting for the dia. She talked in detail about pre-war cuisine, mentioning a lot of dishes. I'm very grateful to her, but she was always avoiding the issue of starvation. Only after our fifth encounter, she herself called me and asked me whether we could change the rules and give way to Holocaust memories. I think in her case, food created trust between us. While she was making her testimony about her Holocaust testimony, I had to realize how remembrance is a physical effort. She was wheezing, she was grabbing her skirt, her whole body was working to remember. As she was remembering, and she was relating for the first time when she was 94. Her body became an archive of tasteless foods measured in gulps and bites because those foods mentioned by her didn't have any taste, didn't have any smell. She could just count it, how many gulps of coffee she had in the morning or how many bites. We were cooking together the geringli, a forgotten starter. I think it's also known in other parts of Eastern Europe. It is a gizzard pate made with thickening. I didn't present the photo because it's not very presentable as its texture. I choose instead a common photo while we were preparing it. Helena Kine's recipe later became a very famous among my interviewees who could only remember the name of the food. So when I informed them that I finally got the recipe, everybody was very satisfied, and I am still preparing it, and everybody is still preparing it. The third group is those who were born in assimilated families. As far as I've been connected to these people. They insisted on speaking about the contradiction of hunger and in concentration camps and the prosperity they were used to before, without mentioning any culinary moment, as it happened to Zsuzsa Diamantstein, born in 1923 in my native town. Speaking to her and letting her to confess, I realized how food memories can turn into something else. During starvation, for instance, in KZ, while inmates dreamt about food and made virtual and wishful cooking, Auntie Zsuzsa closed her ears and was engaged in interior design activities and home decoration because she was dreaming about convenient furnishing. So in this case, instead of cooking together, I prepared her favorite pastries of her childhood, the Flodny Fladen and the Homentash. I thought a lot about the reasons of inaccuracy, and I thought that the porosity of memory, it couldn't be a reasonable answer for this. And I had to realize that all of my interviewees were teenagers who didn't keep house before deportations, and all of their memories relating to kitchen were based on a memory of a taste, a movement of a mother, a smell or of a familiar dish. They had to dig very deep into the most painful past, into the memory of their exterminated family, which had been part of their life for a good 75 years prior. But reasons are multiplied as communist era gained more and more space in people's life. Food is always scarce and related to power, and starting with 1960s, there are huge queues for food. Here I will show you a bread ticket from the early 80s, and then a queue for meat. I would like to go on because I would like to finish. And I had to realize that there is no traditional dish, no kosher dish without ingenuity. There is always a struggle satisfying hunger and also the try to keep the kosher laws, sometimes at the cost of giving up eating meat. There are also the communist Saturdays which cancel the practice of Shabbat. Cholet, for instance, there is nobody who can take it out from the oven, since everybody is working in the factory or in the field. There was also an ambiguity of hunger and food export. While the population was starving, Ceausescu made an economic contract with Israel. He founded kosher slaughterhouses from state slaughterhouses, and which produces kosher meat for international export. This picture was taken at the kosher slaughterhouse of my native town, transformed each Thursday into kosher from the state normal slaughterhouse, and sockets are coming from Israel. But in the meantime, the libel is also awakening, and rumor is also awakening in the town. Christians are pretending that Jews are making their Passover bread with blood of Christians due to these slaughterhouses. Anyhow, what was new to me during this whole research and these interviews, which took me almost 4 years, that culinary approach helped my interviews to exit panels, that human bodies and archive, furthermore senses reorganize memories, that food talk mobilize narratives of survivors and resistance, and the meaning of new beginning, that recipes were put together of crumbs of memories. This is the book both in the Hungarian and English edition, and I used the same associative technique, applying the sensory and perception-based aspects of memory and making a patchwork of fragments of senses. And the dissemination, that's just a couple of words of it. I've told you that I was focusing on imprinting tastes for imprinting the memories and make the stories real and make the stories present. Hopefully my ideas are working. So keeping the memory alive, cooking together with friends, and a very intimate question. Helena Kain hadn't eaten meat for more than 5 years, and this was the cost to stay kosher. Each time I brought her kosher meat from Hungary, she insisted on giving me a bottle of kosher plum palinka brandy made by her husband 20 years ago. And I decided I only offer those from this brandy who are willing to listen to Aunt Helena's story. And finally, but not least, teaching young people to cook. This photo was taken in Rome 2019 at Tor Carbone Chef School on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. They are holding a fladen made by themselves, taught by me. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As we could expect, it was really different approach. So I think that really enables us to enrich our view of culinary research, the food history and food memory. You use it several times, the crucial question of identity. Speaking of national, religious identity, and connected it with kind of culinary identity or national religious identity expressed by culinary means. Then a very important and I think really very well presented the question of food memories. Food memory that, as you emphasized yourself, was so strong that it was surprising even for your speakers. Then I was also struck by the repeating story of Socket in different communist or post-communist country. In Poland, it was forbidden already before the Second World War. Then the discussion started again some few years ago. So the question appears in maybe not very different countries, but in different countries of Central and Eastern Europe in really very similar situation. Then you ended with the task or nice task of teaching young people. So it's a kind of heritage, patrimony, and memory for future, very important, and maybe the most important in the moment for the next generation. Thank you very much. I think that we ask you together on several detailed questions, and now we pass to the third paper, third author, who is Andras Kerner. Andras Kerner, who will explain us how to write a cookbook. Really a very crucial question. Andras Kerner is an architect, was born in Budapest, then moved in 1968 to the United States, and since his retirement, he dedicates his time to writing books and organizing exhibitions. And he's interested in everyday life and cuisine of Hungarian Jews before 1945. He's the author of Jewish Cuisine in Hungary, a cultural history. So maybe the very crucial answer for our section, how to read cookbook, and we are ready to hear your answer, Andras. So please start your talk.
Well, as you can hear, I'm an amateur, and I'm amateur, but for the past close to 20 years, I have been writing books almost exclusively about the daily life and cuisine of Hungarian Jews before the Holocaust. And that's what I would like to talk about. Now, as to how to read a cookbook, there is nothing wrong in reading old cookbooks for only the recipes, but one can also read them in a deeper sense in order to explore what they, as well as the circumstances of their publication, can teach us about past periods. Such reading goes further than the words contained in the book, and by examining its social context, it reads around it and beyond it. This kind of investigation can be especially fruitful in the case of early Jewish cookbooks. Cookbooks are unique sources of researching social and cultural history. The culinary history of Jews is an important part of their social history and should be studied in that context. The neglect of researching Jewish cookbooks is probably related to something Barbara Kirschenblatt mentioned, that is the marginality of social sciences to Jewish studies. Cookbooks should be investigated with the help of the same tools used in examining other historical documents. First, an in-depth analysis of their text and use of language. Second, a study of their sources. And third, a comparison with similar domestic and foreign works. In addition, we should try to determine the publication's purpose and the readership it was written for. Of course, taking a look at what the recipes can tell us about the elementary culture of the period, the material culture of the kitchen and the table, and about the expected readers is equally important. These are only some of the aspects deserving attention, but perhaps they can give you a taste of the things a close reading should include. What makes all Jewish cookbooks new sources of researching Jewish social history? How can a study of them be seen as an innovative method? One of the reasons why they can be considered new sources is that some of them have been virtually unknown until now. And their in-depth study can be considered an innovative method since they very rarely have been examined in a way that unlocks all the fascinating information they and their social context can give us about the past. Now, in the following, I will use the examples of the two earliest such Jewish works published in Hungary to show some of the things we can learn from the proposed close reading of old cookbooks. You can see the title pages of these two books on the screen. As you will see, these works can tell us a great deal about the restrictions curtailing Jewish life in the first half of the 19th century, the process of embourgeoisement of Jews, their social aspirations, the shift in their everyday language, and much, much more. Therefore, I feel that they provide a good example to show how useful a close study of early Jewish cookbooks can be. The first one's German title in English is The Thrifty Jewish Cook, or A New and Complete Cookbook for Jews, an indispensable handbook for hospitable women and daughters, published by Julie Löw, relying on her many years of experience. The title is quite a mouthful, but early cookbooks almost invariably had these incredibly long titles. The book was published in 1840 in Bratislava, a city that today is the capital of Slovakia, but which until 1920 belonged to Hungary. It was not only the first Jewish cookbook in Hungary, but also merely the third in the world. The other Jewish cookbook, the second on the screen, on which I wish to focus, was published in 1854 in Pest. The translation of its Judeo-German title is A New and Complete Cookbook of the Jewish Cuisine, an indispensable handbook for Jewish women and daughters, with instructions for koshering meat and separating challah, as well as for general cleanliness and kashrut, another long title. The largely German text of the book was printed in Hebrew characters, and this makes it the world's first cookbook printed that way. It shows the necessity of thorough systematic research of all Jewish cookbooks that until recently these two trailblazing works were virtually unknown. No researcher described them before my recent book about the cultural history of Jewish cuisine in Hungary. Although Henry Noteker, who is an excellent researcher and bibliographer of early cookbooks, included the 1854 work in his bibliography, even as late as in 2017, he wrote the following about it. There is unfortunately no known copy of this work, but we know from the title that its aim was to give advice about kashrut, including how to prepare the meat correctly. Fortunately, he was mistaken, since at least one copy of this historically important work has survived. Both cookbooks are in German, though the latter one also contains a few Hebrew words and Yiddishisms. Nearly all middle-class Hungarian Jews knew German in the 19th century, and while typically they could also speak Hungarian and mostly Yiddish too, in many cases German was their language of preference. Then, progressively from the 1840s on, local Jews switched to Hungarian as their everyday language, which made their decisive participation in the country's modernization possible. As this image of a page from the 1854 cookbook shows, the page is the beginning of the chapter about soups. The titles in it are printed in the square or block Hebrew typeface and the text in the Weiberdeutsch font associated with Yiddish texts. A further shared feature of the 1840 and 1854 works is that Jewish specialties are completely missing from them, since all the recipes are merely kosher versions of Christian dishes. Both these works were intended for middle-class, urbanized Jewish women who adhere to kashrut rules, but wish to have a cuisine as refined as that of their Christian peers. While both works are based on Rachel Ashman's 1835 Jewish cookbook published in the German state of Saxony, they leave out even the 6 Jewish specialties that appeared quasi-hidden in the appendix of Ashman's book. Like that work, the first 2 Jewish cookbooks in Hungary were manuals of culinary acculturation and upward social mobility. Although both of them exclude Jewish specialties and are in German, they differ in the degree of their Jewishness. The second book was more traditionalist, since even without reading it, its Jewish character was obvious from a glance at the Hebrew letters on its title page. The publishers of both cookbooks started their careers in a settlement adjacent to Bratislava, a city called Pozsony in Hungarian and Pressburg in German. Schlossgrund, the name of this settlement, was one of the places where Jews could live and have businesses before 1840, a period when they were not yet allowed to maintain residences and businesses within Pozsony proper. The M.E. Löwy bookstore, the publisher of the Hebrew lettered volume, was founded in this settlement in 1765, an incredibly early date, and moved to Pest only in 1809. According to newspaper articles recalling the firm's history at the time of its demise in 1897, he was the first and only Jew in Hungary to receive a permit for selling Jewish books. As the 1897 demise shows, the bookstore was not only a very early bookstore in Hungary, but also incredibly long-lived. It lived for 130 years. Before the research on the Hebrew lettered cookbook, the early founding of this bookstore was unknown, which proves that the study of cookbooks can lead to discovery of seemingly unrelated, but on the other hand, highly interesting historical facts. The cookbook published by this bookstore was intended for Jewish women who knew German well, but for whom reading Hebrew and Yiddish characters was still easier than the Fraktur type with which German books used to be printed. While almost all such women knew German, reading books in non-Hebrew characters was not so universal in the middle of the 19th century. Although it is true that the book is mostly in German, it also includes a few Hebrew and Yiddish words. But this was no obstacle for the women who constituted the expected readership of the Hebrew lettered cookbook, because even though they used German much of the time, most of them could also speak Yiddish and were familiar with at least as much Hebrew as was necessary for reading the prayers. Many of the Yiddish books intended for women, including the Zenner, sometimes also called the Women's Bible, were printed in the Weiberdeutsch typeface. So the readers of the 1854 cookbook were familiar with this font used in it. With the partial exception of mostly poor Jews in the eastern and northeastern regions of Hungary, whose preferred language remained the Eastern dialect of Yiddish, there was a gradual shift from the early 19th century on in the language used by Hungarian Jews in daily life. Even before this shift, Jews in the western and central parts of the country used the Western dialect of Yiddish, which was already fairly close to German. Now, bit by bit, they switched from that to the dialect of German used in much of the Austrian Empire, although they retained lots of Yiddishisms in it and frequently spoke it with a Yiddish inflection. By publishing his cookbook in Hebrew lettered German, the publisher tried to accommodate the gradual language shift from Yiddish to German or Hungarian. The book was a transitional object, at the same time forward-looking in its use of German instead of Yiddish and conservative in printing it in Hebrew characters. As all this shows, by studying old cookbooks, we can gain a deeper understanding of historical processes, such as, for example, the 19th century language shift of Hungarian Jews. The cookbook had only one edition, which was a sign of a lack of success in those years, when 2 or 3 editions were by no means a rarity. The probable reason for this lack of success was that Mr. Löwy came to the idea of publishing such a cookbook a decade or 2 late, at a time when German or Hungarian started to replace Yiddish as the everyday language of those Jewish women who could afford to buy it. As part of this process, it was becoming easier for many of them to read German printed in the Fraktur type than in Hebrew characters. Another reason was that some of those women considered reading German books printed in the Fraktur typeface, and later also books in Hungarian, of course, printed in Latin letters, as part and parcel of adapting themselves to majority society in the hope of becoming more accepted by it. Now the next slide shows the cover of my next book, scheduled to be published by Central European University Press around the end of this year. It will include much more detailed discussions of the 1840 and 1854 cookbooks, in addition to essays on several other early cookbooks in Hungary and in Germany. Research of the early Jewish cookbooks in Hungary not only succeeded in uncovering the publication history and social context of previously overlooked works, but it also highlighted how much of that country had been at the vanguard in this respect. Even after years of researching early Jewish cookbooks, it was quite a surprise for me to realize this. After all, there were so many other countries with substantial Jewish populations in the 19th century. As the table on the screen shows, the first earliest printed Jewish cookbook appeared in 1815 at a time when books about various kinds of Gentile cuisine had been in existence for centuries. I mean, in Italy, in France, there have been cookbooks 2, 3, 4 centuries before. The demand for Jewish cookbooks only arose when modernization increasingly affected a significant share of the Jews and the society around them, resulting in the emergence of a Jewish middle class. Assimilation changed not only the language Jews used, the education they chose, and the kind of clothing they wore, but also the dishes they ate, and this had an impact even on those middle-class Jews who continued to keep a kosher kitchen. As part of this process, middle-class Jewish women became increasingly aware of customs and lifestyles of the surrounding majority society. As part of their striving for upward social mobility, they wished to have a cuisine as refined as the Christians of similar social standing, and, just like the Gentiles, to have cookbooks with recipes reflecting those standards. As we can also see from this table, Hungary was not only the first country after Germany to publish a Jewish cookbook, but it was also at the international forefront in the overall number of such works published in the 19th century. As you can see from the table, 3 countries published by far the largest number of Jewish cookbooks in the 19th century: Germany, Hungary, and Britain. And all the other countries published much less, far fewer. And the reasons for this are manifold. Perhaps the most important reason is that in the latter half of the 19th century, the Jewish population of Hungary was second only to that of the Russian Empire, which included the Polish territories, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and some other regions. The readership of Jewish cookbooks almost completely consisted of middle-class Jews, who constituted a comparatively large share of Hungarian Jewry and an even larger one in Budapest. Only in Germany was the number of middle-class people within the Jewish population greater than in Hungary, but their concentration in big cities never reached the level that existed in Budapest, the second largest city in Europe after Warsaw. The number of middle-class Jews in Budapest, however, almost certainly exceeded those in Warsaw. Few Jewish cookbooks were imported from Germany to Hungary. Few Jewish books in general were imported from Germany to Hungary in the 19th century. Therefore, the demand for Jewish cookbooks had to be satisfied by local publishers. Although Austrian books were available in Hungary, but not any Jewish cookbook since their first such work was only published well into the 20th century. Another reason for the considerable number of such works published in Germany and Hungary was that they could be also sold in foreign countries with large German-speaking Jewish populations. There are still many hardly or not at all explored areas in the research of early Jewish cookbooks. Perhaps the most obvious and most glaring omission is that to this day, no comprehensive study exists of all the 19th and early 20th century Jewish cookbooks published in Germany, the country where, after all, the first such book appeared. Now, closing, as I close my talk, as we could see, recent research of early Jewish cookbooks has produced much fascinating and previously unknown information about them and about Jewish life in the periods when they were published. I hope this presentation has made it clear that early Jewish cookbooks indeed represent new sources in the research of Jewish social history. By using innovative methods for studying them, such as the proposed close reading that goes beyond the words they contain, we can learn more from them than how to cook this or that dish, which of course does not mean that recipes prepared from them cannot be most enjoyable, as I know from years of trying them out. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very useful lesson, full of very strict observations and advices for us. How to read cookbook, really fundamental question. You stressed the need of comparisons, of contexts, of goals of the cookbooks, of the lecturers to whom it was addressed. I really didn't realize that the study of the early Jewish cookbooks was so neglected, and I was really impressed by the fact that you could find the cookbook that was omitted by so eminent specialists like Henry Notecker. But from another hand, it seems that really many old cookbooks are lost, forgotten, or damaged because the use of them for practical goals was in some way dangerous, or they are so often damaged that really it's sometimes difficult to find them, some old copies. So you also used very deep, important notions like acculturation, social promotion, like Jewishness, like once again the question of identity. And you stressed several times that is nothing wrong, as I think myself, to read cookbook just to obtain an instruction for cooking. However, as Professor Kitchenblatt stressed, sometimes it could be read just for distraction, just as a kind of aspiration. However, it's from one hand obvious, from another hand, it's difficult to prove. So like this, we had three very interesting papers concerning food and cookery, cuisine, and especially cookbooks in Austria, Vienna, Hungary, and Transylvania. So a big part of the old Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. And I think that maybe some observations may be an effect of very specific context, so of this political attitude of the Austro-Hungarian or Austrian Viennese government, a kind of open attitude towards different nations, traditions. For example, some famous cookbooks from 19th, 20th century are represent multicultural, multinational cuisine of multinational monarchy. However, I'm not sure whether it was the same with Hungary. Anyway, I think that there is time to present some questions, some chosen questions to you, posed especially by Professor Kirschenblatt-Gimblet. She was, like me, and I think many of us, inspired, a bit maybe surprised by the richness of sources used by Susan Belovary. And very interesting question, which sources, Susan, do you find most useful, most important? If you use so many different texts or even no texts, may you distinguish something as especially promising, useful for you?
So this is complex. On the one side, I can't say which ones are most useful because, as you've seen, I look at so many different facets, right? And certain sources are more useful for one aspect of the Viennese cuisine than others. And I would like to give you an example of that. The Hess cookbook had recipes that used blood. And when I realized that, I looked at it, and it turns out they were developed for the city of Vienna. So you have to go to records from the city of Vienna. And it turned out they were developed by the cooking school, which means I go to the cooking school records. And then I found the name of the person whose name was Skalitzer. So then, I started my research 25 years ago, more or less. So many records were not yet easily available, even though the Jewish community across the globe was one of the first that realized the potential of the internet for genealogical research. So here I find records in the local address directories in Vienna. And then I found a record actually showing that Skalitzer and his brothers are in Vienna already around 1908, being members of an anti-dueling society. So, those records. So eventually I can pinpoint him and find out he did a dissertation, which are records on dissertations in Germany. Then I find patent records showing that he invented this blood flour. So I try to trace him genealogically. At that time, that wasn't really easy. I find an obituary, so newspapers about his mother, which shows that by the early 1930s, he's actually in Czechoslovakia. So I go to the city records there for registration. So, I use genealogical records, and after about 10 years, I find that he had a second family. I trace them. I get in contact with the son who still lives. I visit him in the Czech Republic twice, last time a month ago, and we do 5 days of living together and talking. And suddenly the last half hour, he realizes 2 things. He remembers them. One is, because I'm trying to figure out why is an engineer doing blood flour, right? Turns out in the family area, and the father died when he was about 11, laid around some objects that were black. And his sister, who's younger, remembered this was plastic made out of blood. So this opens a new direction into polymer history, but it also then goes into records of after the war restitution, where unfortunately the family handed over original records of the father to a restitution lawyer in Germany, who eventually was indicted because he defrauded Holocaust survivor families of their restitution money. So this kind of shows you that one little aspect of it, right, explodes into how many sources you may need to find it. Last sentence, very useful, of course, were unfortunately newspapers, because cookbooks were not that widespread until you had cheaper paper, more printing presses, women more involved in the public sphere, et cetera, et cetera. So newspapers were very important. Those changed after the 1848 revolution and slowly started to include representations of everyday life, but always ignored popular culture, food, and other things. Genealogical records, cultural representations of culinary events. But again, as I tried to show with that one example, I can't even say which one is most useful, except that I always use those.
Okay, thank you very much for this explanation. I think that we could try to ask next person and then turn once again to first author. So a question to Julia. Did you consider cookbooks or collections of recipes that Jewish women in the camps made or recited or just memorized to each other, talk about them as they were starving?
Yes, absolutely. I consider them cookbooks, or yes, and a collection of recipes. Nevertheless, I did not use them in my book. I use as a primary source a cookbook for survival, Lichtenwörth, written by 5 women in 1944-45. Published in Hungary. I don't know whether in other parts of the world this was edited or published. This is very interesting. 5 women relating about their dreams and making up new recipes and just collecting older recipes. When I asked about this cookbook, and I asked about writing on relating imaginary cookbooks in the camp, most of my interviews told me that they never cooked those recipes when they returned after liberation. One, for instance, Aunt Helena, about whom I mentioned with the kosher palinka, she, for instance, was dreaming about milk. Nevertheless, she hated milk in pre-war times, and she made a vow that when she returns home, she will drink milk every day. And no, after returning, after liberation, after getting back to some kind of normal, she could never drink milk anymore, just like as pre-war. So yes, I was using them as illustration and demonstrating that they were such influences of the cuisine in the camps for survival, but I didn't consider them recipes worth for preparation.
Thank you very much. So the question for Andras. The question, you started your paper with cookbook that describes a kind of non-Jewish cuisine or a kind of Hungarian cuisine just translated in some culinary Jewish language, or just presented for Jewish lecturers. The question is when and why actually Jewish specialties start to appear in Jewish and maybe also in non-Jewish cookbooks?
Well, the first Jewish cookbooks, yes, they contained exclusively or almost exclusively, not 100%, but most of them, non-Jewish dishes in kosher versions. So in that sense, they were Jewish because they were kosher. They were Jewish because of the religious requirement of what one can eat and what one cannot eat. But they were not Jewish culturally in the sense that they contained the Jewish culinary tradition. They, in fact, excluded it. But many cookbooks, and not only Jewish cookbooks, but other cookbooks, actually don't exactly reflect what people ate. They reflect what people ate, but also reflect people's aspirations, what they would have liked to eat. And in that sense, the early Jewish cookbooks, while they did not include Jewish specialties, they contained dishes what those people who wrote those cookbooks and those people who read those cookbooks felt that they were relevant to their aspirations, their social aspirations. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to be part of the majority society, but at the same time, they did not want to give up kashrut. Now, as an exception, some traditional Jewish recipes appear quite early. Actually, they appear already in the appendix, quasi-hidden in Rachel Ashman's cookbook published in 1835 in Saxony. But more concentrated and more obviously, they appear only in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And specifically in Hungary, the first time they appear in a cookbook, which is an excellent, excellent cookbook, by far the best Jewish cookbook published in the 19th century, of a cookbook Theresa Lederer published again in German in 1876 in Pest, in Budapest. By that time it was Budapest. And that has a chapter about Jewish specialties. And in fact, she felt that it was so important that on the title page of the book, she printed the original dishes of Jewish cuisine in enlarged letters to emphasize it. And other people took notice, and several other cookbook authors stole from her actually whole chapters. There is a cookbook author, Sarah Kohn, who published a cookbook in the 1880s in Germany, and she simply expropriated the whole chapter, Zack und Pack, from Theresa Lederer's cookbook about traditional Jewish dishes. Of course, without giving credit. I mean, nobody gave credit in those years. And so, in a way, including traditional Jewish dishes was a second step. It followed by some decades the initial step, which was trying to catch up with the Gentiles socially and in terms of having cookbooks.
So thank you very much. I'm not at all a specialist in Jewish cuisine. I work rather on the old 16th, 17th, 18th century recipes, especially from Poland and other European countries. But I'm just working on manuscript cookbook from 18th century, and there is Jewish pike described by the cook of the last king of Poland, but it's nothing to do with our Jewish pike or Jewish carp. It's really kind of French cuisine, completely different. Then I was surprised how much in Poland Jewish cuisine from 19th century is continuing some Baroque cuisine from 17th century, some Oriental spicy, sweet cuisine, then how they use sometimes very surprising figures like blood soup, black blood soup. So there is no blood in it, like in this Baroque version that only imitates the use of blood and make you sure that there is blood in it. So maybe we could sometimes continue with this broader chronological context.
Can I say something concerning this? That Jewish cuisine, on one hand, was tremendously traditional and going back to the antiquities and preserved tradition. On the other hand, it was constantly absorbing new influences. So it was this strange duality. And in Hungarian Jewish cuisine, they preserved certain traditional historical cuisine that was no longer common in Hungarian cuisine at the time. For example, my great-grandmother, whose kosher collection of recipes of approximately 130 recipes survived from the 1860s, she uses in about a quarter of the recipes, both in savory recipes and both in desserts, ginger, powdered ginger. And by that, powdered ginger used to be one of the most common spices in the Middle Ages. But by the second half or late 19th
century, in Eastern Europe, very long time, really.
It practically disappeared from Hungarian cuisine because paprika sort of ruled the field and took over and sort of pushed out all the other spices. But my great-grandmother, typically for this sort of conservative nature of Jewish cuisine, preserved something that was typical of a much, much earlier period. Also mixing salty, savory dishes with sweet dishes on the same plate, together, serving salty and savory dishes together. It was very common in traditional Jewish cuisine, while it was not at all common in Gentile cuisine ever since the 17th century. French cuisine more and more tried to separate these flavors. So in a way, Jewish cuisine preserved certain traditions that more or less disappeared in general cuisine.
Thank you very much. There is 8 o'clock. It was very rich, very, very good, very useful experience. There is a lot of other questions, and we have no time to ask you, no time to hear your answers. But we could, if you wish, continue in the coffee room. You can find the coffee room at the right side of the stage C. Then, are you able to see the questions from people or not? Or it's only
I copied
visible
them
for me? Yeah. So you could answer yourselves. I will end by a very interesting remark that especially the methodology and the way of presenting collected data is fascinating for our public, and that they find it so useful that it's maybe an opportunity to publish it, to publish something special on this methodology and collecting of data, using of cookbooks or culinary history.